Hey heroes, and welcome to another adventurous episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Before we jump into this week's tale, let's first set the stage by delving into the ancient history of Earth in the Marvel Universe. Just 20,000 years ago, the shape of the world's continents were noticeably different from what we know today. At that time, the land masses corresponding to Africa, Europe, and Asia formed a single supercontinent known as Thuria, which was divided into several major kingdoms. For example, in the northwest, there was the snowy kingdom of Thule, which was known for its mysterious icy caverns. Most notably, however, was the land of Valusia, which was ruled by a mighty warrior known as Kull circa 18,500 BC. Among his many exploits, he notably slaughtered many of the Serpent Men, a race of humanoid reptiles created by the evil elder god Set, and in doing so helped solidify humanity's dominance over the land. So legendary was he that his name became synonymous with the word king in Valusia, but in the centuries following his reign, the kingdom fell into a state of decline. Meanwhile, to the west of Thuria, there was Kull's birthplace, the continent of Atlantis, which by 18,000 BC had become far more scientifically advanced than most other human kingdoms. Further west still was the Pictish Isles, whose denizens had a long-standing enmity with the people of Atlantis. By 18,000 BC, a number of Picts had traveled to the Thurian continent and established a colony along the mountains of Valusia's southern frontier. I will note that there were also Atlantean colonists in Thuria, some of whom are said to have intermarried with barbarian tribes that would eventually be known as Elder Cimmerians. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet in the Pacific Ocean, there was the Kingdom of Lemuria, which was primarily controlled by the monstrous deviant race who endeavored to enslave mankind. Circa 18,000 BC, however, there was an incident known as the Great Cataclysm, which caused earthquakes and flooding across the entire planet. Now, we've talked about the events and circumstances that caused this global catastrophe on the channel before, so check out the links in the description for even more information there, but suffice it to say the upheaval permanently altered the shape of the Earth's land masses, sinking both Atlantis and Lemuria to the bottom of the ocean. While many Atlanteans sank with their kingdom, a small fraction of which adapted to their new environment by becoming water breathers, others escaped the sinking city by boat and made their way to the Thurian continent. Once there, the Atlanteans clashed with the Picts who had already settled on the continent, with both groups eventually descending into barbarism. Meanwhile, many Lemurians also survived by making their way to the eastern side of the continent, only to be enslaved by an ancient race who already lived there. In the midst of all this, a group of people from the Thurian continent fled into the frozen northern mountains, led by a mighty chief named Bori, who was ultimately deified by his followers in subsequent generations, and thus his tribe became known as the Hyborian. Meanwhile, further natural disasters ensued, culminating in a second, lesser cataclysm 500 years after the first, which ultimately left what was once the continent of Thuria divided into east and west, with an inland sea called the Vilayet in between. Amidst all of this, humanity's empires and societies fell into ruin, but over the following 1,000 years, the survivors went on to establish new kingdoms. Through generations of nothing but bloody war, the descendants of the Atlanteans and the Picts had lost any semblance of their previous culture or civilization, with the former devolving into roaming bands of simple-minded ape men, while the latter became a cave-dwelling people that other nations regarded as savage and primitive. The descendants of enslaved Lemurians, meanwhile, rose up against their oppressors and migrated to the southwest of the continent, where they overthrew a nation of surviving serpent men and established their own kingdom of Stygia, where they largely became worshippers of the elder serpent god Set. Directly to the south of that were what was known as the Black Kingdoms, which included numerous nations and tribes of varying sizes, such as Kush, Darfar, Kashan, and more. To the north of Stygia, Lemurian descendants also established the kingdom of Acheron, a wizard-controlled theocracy that flourished for about 2,500 years. Meanwhile, the descendants of surviving barbarians from Thule remained in the continent's most northwestern region, which became known as Nordheim. By 16,000 BC, that land was split into two areas, Asgard in the east and Vanaheim in the west, each of which shared their name with a realm from Asgardian cosmology. The denizens of these realms, the Aesir and the Vanir, not to be confused with their godly counterparts, were hunters and warriors who worshipped the frost giant Ymir. Around the same time, to the east of Nordheim, the Hybori established their own barbaric kingdom of Hyperborea. Having grown hearty and warlike after generations of living in the snowy north, the Hybori gradually began migrating south, invading other lands as they did. Around 13,000 BC, the Hyborians conquered and destroyed the kingdom of Acheron, which by that point had spread itself too thin by annexing neighboring territories, leaving its northern frontier vulnerable. As a result, the invaders were able to take these lands and divide them as they saw fit. By 12,000 BC, the Hybori had established various kingdoms across the western half of the continent, including Nemedia, Brythunia, Koth, Opir, Argos, Corinthia, and the Border Kingdom. Perhaps most notable, however, was Aquilonia, which ultimately became the most powerful and influential kingdom on the western side of the continent. And so, because of these successful conquests, this period of time is widely referred to as the Hyborian Age. But now we turn our attention to one specific region of the Hyborian continent, Cimmeria, which sat between other notable lands. To the north were the Aiglofian Mountains, which separated the area from the Aesir and Vanir of Nordheim. To the south there were the Bosonian Marches, on the other side of which was Gunderland, the northernmost province of Aquilonia. To the west was the Pictish Wilderness, or Pictland, which was populated by the descendants of surviving Picts who had split into various tribes and clans, each of whom developed their own culture and traditions. And to the east was the Border Kingdom, a desolate wasteland of swamp, bog, and dreary plains that served as a bulwark between Cimmeria and the Hyborian kingdoms of Nemedia and Brythunia. This somber land of Cimmeria was populated by the barbaric descendants of what were once Atlanteans, but by this point were simply known as Cimmerians. Forming tribes of hunter-gatherers, the people of Cimmeria were large and powerful, commonly having dark hair and gray or blue eyes. Between the dark, humid forests and the gray skies of their homeland, the Cimmerians were often sullen and moody, in stark contrast to the high-spirited barbarians of Nordheim. They were also fierce warriors who wielded iron weapons and clashed with both the Picts and the Vanir, although they did form something of an informal alliance with the Aesir. In terms of religion, the Cimmerians acknowledged and respected the grim mountain god Crom, but to say that they worshipped him would be somewhat inaccurate, as the Cimmerians believed that the gods were indifferent to mankind and uninterested in worship. While they rarely engaged in prayer, it was common for Cimmerians to invoke the name of Crom, and they believed that the souls of the dead would wander forever on his cold, misty mountain. Sometime around 10,000 BC, give or take a few centuries, in the northern region of Cimmeria, there was a clan called the Snowhawk tribe, which boasted many mighty warriors, including Garad, Jungalt, Corum, and Drogon, who was originally from a southern clan but fled from his own people due to a blood feud and took refuge with the Snowhawks. There, one of these men begat a son named Coran, who grew into a talented blacksmith and is said to have crafted the best swords in all of Cimmeria. Coran in turn joined with a woman named Grecian, who became pregnant with his child. 9 months later, a horde of raiders from Vanaheim attacked the Snowhawks, and Coran fought alongside his tribesmen while Grecian went into labor. As a result, Coran and Grecian's son Conan was born on a snowy, wind-swept battlefield. Now, I will note that Corum and Drogon have both been identified as Conan's grandfathers, but as far as I can tell, it's unclear which man was Coran's father and which was Grecian's. From the moment he was born, Conan was trained to be a warrior, as was tradition for Cimmerian boys. He grew up learning not just of his own culture, but stories of other lands and civilizations. His father passed on his fighting and blacksmithing skills, and his mother taught him about music, poetry, and art, and Conan was attentive with every lesson regardless of the topic. By this point, however, while Coran was indeed a mighty warrior, his work as a blacksmith had kept him off the battlefield. And so while he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps, Conan longed not to craft weapons, but to wield them. Spurred on by pride and ambition, Conan quickly surpassed his peers in strength and stature, and by the time he reached adolescence he had become a brave and cunning warrior. Throughout his childhood, he had a companion named Mara, or Mala, the daughter of Halfgar the Hillman, and one of the few sources of laughter among the Snowhawks. Conan also had a younger sister named Siobhan, who shared her family's tenacity and spirit. By one account, when Conan was 14 years old, he got into a conflict with a tribesman named Kirhak who disrespected him. In their initial scuffle, Conan defeated and humiliated the older man, and when Kirhak later tried to take vengeance on Conan, inadvertently striking down the elder Garad in the process, Conan gave chase and slew the cowardly assailant by throwing his own spear back through him. There are other tales of Conan's youth, and while time and legend make it difficult to discern fact from fiction, various accounts agree that even as a boy he possessed the might and physique of a full-grown warrior, surpassing the hardiest of his race before he was even considered a man. On his 15th birthday, Conan's friends and family watched as he underwent a rite of passage by wrestling a gigantic, rampaging bull. And in the end, he proved his immense strength by snapping the animal's neck with his bare hands. That same midwinter night, he was sent out into the snowy, wooded hills with nothing but a sword and bearskin cloak to protect him. He hunted, cooked, and took shelter under a fallen log for the night, and while he could have returned home the following morning, he longed to explore further, and ventured deeper into the forbidden northern hills. There he was spotted by the beautiful and enigmatic bear priestess Ursula, who invited him back to her home and, intrigued by the young man, acquainted him with the more intimate aspects of adulthood. Meanwhile, on the southern side of Cimmeria, the Aquilonian Gundermen were attempting to push their borders further north, building an outpost city called Venarium. And so after returning to the Snowhawk village and regaling the elders with his tale, Conan was allowed to join his fellow warriors when they launched an attack on Venarium, and he was one of the first to leap into battle. After forcing the Aquilonians to retreat back to their own territory, Conan returned to his village, but yearned for more adventure, and subsequently joined a group of Aesir, aiding them in their raids against their mutual foe, the Vanir, in his search for fortune and glory. Around this time there was also an incident in which a lone Conan was pursued by a vengeful Vanir and took refuge in a hidden underground chamber containing a magic sword. He attempted to claim the weapon for himself, however the blade's enchantment caused his own shadow to come to life and attack him. While Conan was ultimately victorious, setting fire to the chamber to fill it with light, he nonetheless abandoned the blade, and this experience would be one of many to contribute to his overall distaste for sorcery. At 16 years old, he joined a band of raiders led by an Aesir named Olav, and encountered a hermit shaman that showed him visions of the past, including the reign of King Kull and the fall of Atlantis, as well as visions of the future, including one in which Conan crowned himself king of a mighty Hyborian empire. While wandering the lands of Asgard, Conan came upon a race of white-furred beastmen who brought him to their underground city of Brutheim and attempted to enslave him. But in the end, Conan inspired his fellow humans to revolt and overthrow their cruel masters. After leaving the city, he was ambushed and captured by a Vanir war party, who brought him to a fishing village to the west where Conan saw the Western Sea for the first time. This time he was set free in exchange for helping the Vanir defeat a sea demon that threatened the village. After that, Conan met an Aesir war chief named Njal and joined his band of reavers on a quest into Hyperborea to rescue Njal's daughter Ran from the witch queen Vamatar. While they succeeded in freeing Ran, Njal was killed and many others were overwhelmed by the witch queen's undead forces and captured, including Conan. However, they later escaped when Ran returned with more Aesir and launched an attack on Vamatar's castle. While his arms were still shackled by Hyperborean chains, Conan evaded his pursuers and fled south into Brythunia. There he sided with the Brythunians in a conflict with an ambitious Hyperborean underking named Tomar, which ultimately ended when Tomar and the Brythunian king Brian slew each other in combat. Disillusioned with the idea of seeking fame and fortune in the frozen north, a now 17-year-old Conan traveled southeast into the kingdom of Zamora, where he spent time working as a palace guard in Antagonides, a prefect of the Zamorian city-state Ramiraj, before making his way to Aranjun, the fabled city of thieves, where he had more adventures still, including one in which he attempted to make a name for himself by climbing and pilfering the mystical Tower of the Elephant, where he found a blind captive alien named Yag Kosha, who was being held there by the tower's master, the wizard Yara. Yag Kosha ultimately convinced Conan to help facilitate his plan to take vengeance on Yara, albeit at the cost of the alien's life, and in the end the tower shattered into shimmering pieces, while Conan escaped with little more than a few unremarkable pieces of treasure. When subsequent attempts at thievery and fencing stolen goods also went poorly, Conan fled east into the Kanzankian Mountains. There he had an encounter with a dwarf-like race descended from a group of displaced Kushites, clashed with a monstrous demon that was menacing a mountain village, and passed through a mysterious fog that brought him to a parallel Earth where his counterpart, Konar, ruled the kingdom of Aquilonia. After returning to his home dimension, he had several adventures in the Zamborian city of Shadazar the Wicked, during one of which he met a charming but untrustworthy woman named Jenna. Afterwards, he traveled westward along the fabled Road of Kings, passing through Corinthia and into Nemedia. In the city of Numalia, he had his first encounter with the sinister man-serpents and got a glimpse of their master, the Stygian sorcerer Thoth Amon, who would later become his most dangerous enemy. He continued to have other adventures along the Road of Kings and surrounding areas, during which he reunited with Jenna, who became his traveling companion for a time. However, when Conan got into trouble with the Corinthian authorities, she ultimately betrayed him to save herself, and Conan was cast into prison. Before too long, he was approached by a Corinthian prince named Murillo, who freed him in exchange for his help in defeating his enemy, the Red Priest Nabonidus. Around 18 years old by this point, Conan next traveled south into Koth, where he had yet more adventures, one of which pitted him against another notable Stygian sorcerer, Kulan Gath. He subsequently traveled east to Turan and encountered pirates on the Viliet Sea, ultimately ending up on the eastern side, where he visited the Hyrcanian city-states of Makalet and Pa-Disha. It was there that Conan first encountered another legendary hero of the Hyborian Age, a scarlet-haired woman known as Red Sonja. Suffice it to say, this would not be the last time they met, but her tale is another story entirely. During this time, Conan sided with Turan in a conflict with the Hyrcanians called the War of the Living Terram, and had further adventures on the eastern side of the continent before returning to the west and winding up back in Zamora. He eventually made his way back to Cimmeria and avenged the death of his childhood friend Mara when she was killed by Vanir raiders. After a few more exploits in the frozen north, he once again rode south into Hyborian lands and continued to wander from place to place, having more adventures than we could possibly cover in a single video. He eventually reunited with his old ally Murillo of Carinthia, who by this point had founded a mercenary group called the Crimson Company, which Conan then joined as a soldier of fortune, becoming Captain Murillo's second-in-command. At the same time, he had an encounter with a daring acrobat from Hanumar named Terra, who also insisted on joining Murillo's mercenaries. The Crimson Company were eventually employed by the Ophirian city-state of Ronico, and decided to remain there after a peace was brokered between Ronico and its rivals Carnola and Pergona. Uninterested in peaceful times, Conan rode west with Terra and her lover Yusef, eventually reaching the seaport capital of Argos, Messantia. There, Yusef killed a guardsman who sought to force himself on Terra, and while the young lovers fled, Conan clashed with the authorities before escaping to the seaport and leaping aboard a departing vessel, the Argus. On the Western Sea, however, the crew of the Argus encountered the most infamous pirates of the era, the Black Corsairs, and their legendary captain, Belit, the Queen of the Black Coast. Enamored with Conan, Belit decided to claim the Cimmerian as her own, and convinced him to join her crew as her first mate and lover. And so, for a time, Conan lived the life of a pirate, sailing the high seas and fighting alongside Belit and the Black Corsairs against all manner of foe, including many encounters with the Set-worshipping Stygians. Amidst the combat and adventure, Belit became the first long-sustained love of Conan's life. It was also during this time that Conan was best known as Amra, the Lion of the Waves. After 3 years of romance and adventure, however, Belit and the Black Corsairs were slain by a monstrous creature in the jungles of Kush. Conan, of course, survived, and in the ensuing battle with the beast, he was aided by the ghost of his dead lover, who manifested just long enough to save his life before disappearing once again. After defeating the creature, Conan placed Belit's body on the deck of their ship, the Tigris, and pushed it out to sea while setting it alight, letting the beloved vessel serve as her funeral pyre. Melancholic in the wake of this tragedy, Conan again wandered the continent. From the Black Kingdoms to the Hyborian lands to the frozen north, he continued to find enemies, allies, and adventures at every turn. Eventually he returned to his homeland again and learned that in his absence, the Snowhawk tribe had been conquered by a rival clan, the Diarmaids, who were ruled by an old witch named Morag and her grandson Maglokun. Among the few surviving Snowhawks, Conan's only remaining family members were 2 cousins, Humber and Lochran, and his younger sister, Siobhan. Despite being whipped, beaten, and stabbed, Siobhan ultimately succeeded in killing Morag, while Conan, after reforging his father's sword, struck down Maglokun. Unfortunately, Siobhan subsequently succumbed to her injuries and passed away. Nearly 30 years old by this point, Conan soon left Cimmeria again and continued on his journeys in search of battle and plunder. Over the following decade, he went on to have many more adventures, during which time he made his way as a freebooter, a mercenary, a soldier, and more. During this time, he occasionally journeyed alongside another famous adventurer of the Hyborian Age, a renowned pirate known as Valusia of the Red Brotherhood. Eventually, however, Conan became a soldier for the Aquilonian Empire and fought as a frontier scout during a conflict called the Pictish Wars. After numerous battles and occasional side adventures, Conan's deeds and reputation allowed him to quickly rise through the ranks of the Aquilonian military, and after a decisive victory at the Battle of Velitrium, he was promoted to general and summoned back to the Aquilonian capital. The tyrannical Aquilonian king Numidides, however, was jealous of Conan's popularity and success, and had the Cimmerian imprisoned in the dreaded Iron Tower to await execution. Fortunately for Conan, a trio of conspirators, Count Sorcerer, Lord Prospero, and Dexithius, secretly opposed the king's despotic rule, and enlisted the aid of Conan's erstwhile ally Valeria to free him from prison. Returning to his men, the Lion Regiment, Conan began gathering allies and plotting a revolt against the increasingly mad Numidides. This all eventually came to a head when Conan led his forces in an attack on the capital and slew Numidides himself, after which the Cimmerian crowned himself the new king of Aquilonia. Amidst further adventures, he met a woman named Zenobia, a daughter of nobility from Nemedia, who helped him retain his rule and even saved his life on one occasion, although he did repay the favor more than once. Choosing her to be his bride, Conan and Zenobia were subsequently wed, becoming the king and queen of Aquilonia. The couple soon started a family of their own, and their firstborn son, Con, was heir apparent to the throne. In the years that followed, they had two more children, a girl named Radegund and a boy named Taurus. In his 50s, Conan had yet another battle with his recurring foe, the Stygian sorcerer Thoth Amon. This time, however, it was the 12-year-old Prince Con who slew the sorcerer, stabbing him from behind and saving his father. Years later, when Conan was in his early 60s and Prince Con was 18, Thoth Amon returned through magical means and attempted to take vengeance, but this time Conan was successful in slaying the evil sorcerer once and for all. Unfortunately, not long afterwards, Queen Zenobia passed away while delivering Conan's fourth child. Several years after that, Conan abdicated his throne and embarked on what may have been his final voyage, setting sail on the Western Sea with the intent of carving out a new empire in a new land. His son Con, meanwhile, ascended to the throne in his stead, becoming King Conan II, and carried on his adventurous father's legacy. Alright heroes, that is all I've got time for this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this weekend, so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!